Smoak. So Sam Bradshaw, he puts together these previews of Baylor football opponents, but he also has been unbelievable. He and Brian Etheridge on SicEm365.com have been unbelievable about trying to put together and piece together knowledge on where are the availabilities for college football, for television, for streaming, and much more. Very complicated, and we're gonna bring him on, and then we have some graphics that we'll try to go through. And Sam, thank you for your time, and Craig, Paul, and Smokey with you. First of all, how much exposure can we expect from conference TV deals was the title of this particular piece. What is it trying to find out?
Thanks for having me on. And as mentioned before, these deals get pretty complex for the average fan because most fans are just looking at it from the perspective of my team, what channel are they on? Mm-hmm. Oh, I need to go to this channel. So they're not really looking at the landscape overall, but the landscape overall really determines a lot in terms of what TV deals are there to be made and how that impacts realignment and how that impacts your league's brand. How available are those games to a wide swath of audiences? So for here, you're really looking at what percentage of your games are reaching what portions of the country, and then do you have opportunities with television windows that would be expected to garner big viewership if you have a big matchup? Those were the two main thrusts of what we were looking at. And it was mainly in response to a lot of different numbers being thrown around out of context. So in the interest of just kind of getting an apples-to-apples comparison, we took a look at everybody.
All right. You have sent Paul and Paul to Garrett graphics, so we're going to put the graphic up, and we'll let you explain each one of them. I'm not sure if the graphics themselves have any specific title.
Yeah, no, he gave us an order here. So right. Here on the first one he sent, 2022 exposure by channel distribution. Sam, break this one down for us.
At the bottom of each of those particular graphics or graphs, actually, are the conferences, by the way. So there's that at the bottom.
Yeah, what we're looking at here is each portion of the stacked bar chart represents the percentage of games that are on a network that has typical kind of reach. So at the very top in the darkest green, you've got ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox. Those are your over-the-air stations. They're on 120 million households plus. Then the next rung down is your ESPN, ESPN2, FS1. They're on about 90% of your cable multi-channel stations nationwide. That's about as good as cable distribution gets. The next rung down is around 2/3. That's your CBS Sports Network, NFL Network, SEC Network, Big Ten Network, and FS2. And then after that, the next rung after that is around 50%. That's ESPNU. That is ACC Network. And then beyond that, you've got a little bit of a clutter. You've got networks like Longhorn Network or BYU TV that are really available for that fan base, but aren't really national players. You've got regional TV and syndication and streaming. And for instance, the bigger streaming outlets that you've seen active with college football, whether it be Peacock or the rumors of Apple getting involved with the Pac-12 or ESPN Plus, those are going to be kind of in that 20 million subscriber range. And then at the very bottom, you've got networks that are around 20% of the multi-channel universe in terms of subscriber count. And that's the Pac-12 that's coming in at under 15 million subscribers. So just to try and get an idea of what percentage of your home game inventory, the inventory controlled by a league's television contract, is getting what kind of visibility nationally. And what we can tell from here is that obviously the SEC and Big Ten have just giant visibility based off what they've done with their own networks, but also based off what they get from the over-the-air and cable networks. And then the Big 12 and ACC are kind of neck and neck for third, depending on what you make of the ACC network or what you make of their regional syndication deal versus the Big 12 having a slightly higher percentage on streaming, but also having a slightly higher percentage of games that made it to Fox, NBC, CBS, for instance. Then you have the Pac-12 with incredible visibility on the top half of their inventory, but not much on the bottom, and so on and so forth. I also included BYU and Notre Dame, and averages of P5 conferences and averages of all FBS conferences.
All right, so that's 2022 exposure based on the distribution. All right, what is next? What do we have next, Paul?
It's where the SEC, Big 10, Big 12, and ACC project to be, since they all currently have television deals. So you can see here, so Sam, go into this one right here across the map about where the distribution lies on streaming and over the air.
Right. The Big Ten actually has some streaming this go around because they've got I think 8 games to Peacock, but where they're really killing it is that they've got between 14 and 16 games on each of CBS, NBC, and Fox. And then they'll have a certain amount of games on FS1. And then they've got all those games on Big Ten Network. They've got about as good a visibility as anybody not named Notre Dame. And then the SEC is going to be largely similar to what they've had before. They'll probably get a couple more games on ESPN2, ESPN, ESPNU, simply due to inventory changes based off the contracts ESPN is going to have. And they're effectively swapping out ABC and CBS because ABC took over those rights as part of the recent deal they have. And for the Big 12, I did kind of an estimate on what I thought made sense in terms of what games make sense to be potentially picked up. How many do I think is going to be streaming? I have them doing a little bit more streaming than they've done before. Typically, it's been around 27 to 29% streaming. I have them right at 30% because it's typically been just under 2 games per school. And I've moved them up to a full 2 games. But the absolute maximum I could see ESPN have a business case for would be 33% streaming, because I don't believe ESPN is going to pay more per school than Fox is and broadcast fewer than Fox's 26 games, for instance. I don't see how they make that money up. And then from there, the ACC is largely unchanged until they can get those Raycom sub-license games back later in the decade. And at that point, it depends on what that deal looks like. And then, of course, Notre Dame is likely figures to have a pretty similar deal to what they have now whenever they re-up.
Yeah, they'll have, 2 games on Peacock or something like that?
I think their breakdown is 6 on NBC and 1 on Peacock. Yeah. But, yeah, they're going to be overwhelming network TV and then some streaming element, most likely.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question only because go back to that last graphic, Garrett, if you don't mind. So you're discussing that the Big 12 is around 30% streaming. What is the highest number that a conference would have normally with streaming?
Well, Power 5 or Group of 5 is a big distinction here, because with the Group of 5, like the Sun Belt and Conference USA figure to be in the 70% of streaming, for instance. And the Americans in the high 30%, it really depends on the deal you're striking. But then again, you've also, if you go to the next graphic, the Pac-12 does not have a deal, but there's a lot of rumors that Apple is going to have a major part to play in that. I've heard rumors of all streaming. I've heard rumors of streaming and sub-licensing as the most probable aspects. And again, these are negotiations. They can turn on a dime. Somebody could report today accurately that ESPN and Fox don't want to do a deal, and tomorrow, if the prices and the market changes make sense, they could turn around and do something. But for the purposes of this, I went with the 2 scenarios that I've heard tossed around the most credibly recently, which is the Pac-12 doing a streaming deal, or the Pac-12 doing a streaming deal that has a sub-license component to it, where they sell a certain number of games to a linear broadcaster. So on the left, you see an example of what their deal was in 2022. Then you have kind of what it would be if they had a full streaming deal and they dedicated 30 games, which is 3 for the remaining schools, which is pro rata what they had in 2022 on the Pac-12 network. Then from there, if they gave 28 games in a sub-license deal to like an ESPN or somebody with really good visibility, that's what it would look like. But it leaves very limited amounts of inventory for the streamer to work with, or you have to really reduce the inventory for the Pac-12 network, which is why there's probably a good case for the farthest right column, where they add 2 teams like an SMU or San Diego State so that they have 13 more games to play with. So they have those 13 games that they can sell.
All right, so this graphic, leave it up, Garrett, if you don't mind. Future Pac-12 exposure possibilities. There's 4 columns. The column on the left is what they have been doing.
Yes.
The second column is what is being reported, that is the heavily streaming with it being sub-licensed?
No, all streaming is second.
Also, okay. Well, there's red and there's pink.
Yeah.
The pink is the streaming, but for the purposes of this projection, I left a certain percentage of inventory allocated to the Pac-12 network.
Okay.
Because I have no idea if they contractually can shut that down or if they have costs they still have to recoup. I have no idea what their flexibility on shutting that down is. So I reduced their inventory from the 36 or 37 they've had in recent years to 30 because they lost 2 schools. And I used that to project everything else.
Yeah, Clint Moses, who's, I think, Oregon State guy, Pac Network visibility numbers are horrible. On streaming, the numbers will go up.
Yeah, that's a safe bet. You're talking about a network that has less than 50 million subscribers versus streaming services that have subscriber counts in the 20 million range. So that's 20 to 25 million range, I should say. That's probably a safe bet that it would get more visibility than they've got before, but it depends on if they're able to move that inventory from the Pac-12 network.
Okay, so
because if you look here, a lot of that inventory, if they're just keeping the Pac-12 network and then simply streaming some of the inventory that was getting ESPN or FS1 or ABC or Fox, that would be a step back.
Okay. All right, so the next graphic.
All right, this would be, Sam, so this is if you're basing it on the last 3 years average, I guess 3 of the last 4 with 2020 and how odd that was taken out, because that's, I'm sure, just a number that doesn't make sense because it's not all the same across the board. This is the recent year averages on the exposure that they would get if everything was the same, right?
Correct. That is saying out of all the games that you had broadcast, which television windows in the data that I've got going back over a decade, the middle value, the median value is over 2 million. So for Saturday ABC primetime, that's easily over 2 million. But for instance, Saturday ESPNU primetime is nowhere near that. That would not be included here. And the reason this is important is this is where your really big viewership games largely come from. Over the last few years, I forget the exact number of years I have for this stat, but I think it's like the last 3 or 4 years that were not COVID. The number of games that got 4 million or more viewers that did not come from a window like this, there were 2 of them. And one of them was in 0 week. And all of them used major brands like Florida, Miami, Penn State, and I forget who the final team was, but it's very rare and it takes quite a matchup to overcome that without these. So these are very important to your overall visibility to a lot of casual fans.
All right, so the yellow bar is the is what, Paul? The SEC, and that doesn't surprise anybody. The blue bar is the Big Ten. The red is the Big 12. The green, the Pac-12, and then the ACC is the light blue, which is about not much difference between those 3, and then it drops considerably with the American Conference, and then Notre Dame
on their own.
And then the purple is the Mountain West. Okay. Any other graphics, Garrett?
Yeah, this one, Sam, I think is the most interesting. So if you applied your projection to what the Pac-12 would be, their number drops precipitously.
Right. And what we see is the Big Ten, based off getting a lot of those CBS and NBC and Fox windows, goes up a decent amount. The SEC gets a few more games just off of the expansion with Texas and Oklahoma. You know, they'll probably add 14 games to the SEC inventory. ESPN Plus and SEC Network contractual minimums will probably cut off about half of that. But then from there, the Big 12 figures to be the beneficiary because ESPN is down about 10 games in inventory among the Power 5 level because they lost 27 games from the Big Ten. They lost 5 from BYU, And while they gained about 22 from the SEC, that's still down 10 games before you look at whether or not they retained the Pac-12, where for noon, afternoon, and primetime windows, I think the Pac-12 averaged around 9 of them a year on ABC, ESPN networks. And, that's not necessarily your biggest games, but there's at least a couple of those windows in there from the Pac-12. And then on Fox, if the Big Ten is contractually obligated to give their over-the-air games in the noontime slot to Fox, in the afternoon time slot to CBS, and in the primetime time slot to NBC, there's a lot of Fox afternoon and primetime games for the Big 12 or any other conferences they contract with to potentially fill. I gave them only about half of what I consider that availability to be. And the Big 12 has a lot of upside here. The ACC is going to get maybe a little bit more of those big windows, just with ESPN being down some inventory. But then after that, the Pac-12 really takes it on the chin here, unless they can get one of those major players, whether it be ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, or ESPN, back into the fold, because that's where a lot of these big windows come from. And if they stay out, it's going to be a limited amount of opportunity for those big viewership games.
Steve Moser, these graphs are good. Get Mr. Bradshaw some hair goop, and he's ready for the sports talk show circuit. I don't know what the hell.
Sam's usually well coiffed when I see him.
He is. He absolutely is. I'll read this one, but he didn't follow up on it. I asked him to. Connor, who is without question a fan of the Pac-12, but that's fine. At least he made it a few slides in before I raised an eyebrow, and I asked Connor to follow up on that. I have not seen him. Has he looked at the valuation of Apple buying the Pac-12 network? That was his follow-up question.
I have not looked at the valuation of Apple buying the Pac-12 network. I understand that in hypotheticals, they might be able to do that. I have no idea what price that would cost. I have no idea what it's worth. They could buy a lot of the assets that the Pac-12 network has, but a lot of those technology assets, how current are they? It gets into how much does it cost versus buying new? What's the expected life? There's a lot of things that go into it. And then, much like I hinted at when I was doing my projections, I have no idea what kind of obligations the Pac-12 still has to fill before selling it would potentially be a good idea or a bad idea. I have no idea what their books look like in that regard. So from there's possibility, but it's definitely not something that I feel comfortable speculating on because I don't know enough of the inputs.
Well, wouldn't it also? It would depend on what new distribution they got after they bought it, right?
Right. It's not only what are you buying, but how are you going to be able to leverage it in a way that gets you a return?
Well, here's a couple of responses. It would save Apple and the Pac on production, in my opinion. Fiber optics, cables, and no trucks on site. All the Bay Area production center. And then, of course, there's the Stanford alumni and Cal alumni that make up most of the Apple employees. Larry Pilgrim, Pac-12 updated software, their hardware is top-notch. And you hear about this Pac-12 network as kind of at times an albatross, right, because of the distribution issues. But thanks to the responses in the chat room, too. Is that it? Is there any other, no other grab? Sam, I don't know how you do it. Paxton, by the way, you're going to fail this segment because you haven't been paying attention. And Japhus, I hope I get that right, has the lead student because he was giving the bulging eyeballs because he was actually reading and paying attention. So, Paxton, you are in the Sam Bradshaw dog.
You wrote his name on the board? He has to stay after school?
Yeah,
Paxton?
no, absolutely. Yeah. Connor Johnson, shout out, Sam. So that's another one from the chat room. Great show as always. Hey, Sam, thank you very much for reaching out with all that information. And it will be on Sikkim 360. It is on Sikkim365.com in the premium section where you can really get even more. And Sam responds to a lot of the questions. I think Brian's in there as well with that, too. And we appreciate you doing what you do. Thanks for your time.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. That's Sam Bradshaw Baylor _S11. I would do that with crayons.